Kings and kingdoms will all pass away, but there's something about that name. You know, the church and Christians through history have used that contrast. It happens to be appropriate because that will be our topic tonight, as a matter of fact, in intertestamental period class. They've used that contrast because of the conflict they experienced in trying to live the Christian life under pagan leaders. They saw them as kings, but they saw Christ as the superior king, the King of Kings, as he is referred to in the New Testament. Now, the subject of the imperial cult, C-U-L-T, may be one not familiar to you, but it's our topic tonight, so I hope to acquaint you with that subject. I have a lot to say, but it's relatively easy to understand, which is new. So many things we look at here are difficult. This is easy to follow, and I think we'll be able to do it in probably an hour. Now, it goes by different names. It's been referred to as the imperial cult, as I just said. It's been referred to as the cult of the emperors. And probably its best known designation, the name by which it goes in your outline, is emperor worship. Emperor worship. Now, if you've taken the time to look ahead in the outline, you know that all we have for emperor worship is just emperor worship. There's no points underneath that. So that should alert you to the fact that it's not as significant as some of these others, such as the one we will be to, Lord willing, next week, that is really fascinating and interesting, and into which we'll have to go with more detail. So I'm going to refer to it as emperor worship. I think that's its best known name. Now, I had this broken down into 4 parts to make it easy for you to follow. That ought to make it really easy, because it's an easy topic to begin with, and we're going to look at 4 parts. I just gave you one part, the names by which it goes. Then secondly, we're going to look at its historical background, then we'll look at its development, then we'll look at its relation to Christianity and to the New Testament. So let's begin with the historical background of emperor worship. The imperial cult, or the cult of the emperors. Of course, it means just what it says, emperor worship, the worship of the emperors. The historical background, and here we have 2 points as well. First of all, we want to look at it in antiquity, and then we want to specifically concentrate on the imperial cult or emperor worship in Rome. So let's begin with antiquity then. It's no new thing. Divinity being ascribed to kings or to queens. The divinity of royalty was something that was fairly common in the Eastern world, where you'd have powerful Eastern monarchs come to the throne who were often deified after their death, such as in the cult of the worship of the pharaohs in Egypt. What do you think those pyramids are all about? You would hardly build a mausoleum that size and of that magnitude just for a mere man. But if after passing through the experience of death, one was able to touch one of the rays of the sun, and all of the mysticism involved in Egyptian worship, thereby becoming part of the sun god, or at least a descendant of the sun god yourself, well, certainly it would be due to you to have a mausoleum the size of one of those pyramids. As you know, I've climbed around in one of them before, and they are just incredible. Incredible to go up inside one. They're a lot larger than they appear in pictures, that's for sure. One man would be stationed in there, right in the very center. The Egyptians were magnificent engineers to accomplish a feat like that. But of course, the grave robbers were more ingenious, I think, than the Egyptian engineers. They tried to hide the body, which was also placed in there with many jewels and all types of royal treasures. But the grave robbers would generally find it, and there hardly any of them are left. King Tut was one notable example. And a small fortune in gold and gems, of course, was found in that tomb whenever that was finally discovered and opened. But one I went in didn't have anything. Just an almost unbearable humidity is all you would find in there. You came out just like a dish rag, literally. You'd be out in the Egyptian sun and it wasn't bad until you go inside one of the pyramids. So, you'd kind of hate being a dead pharaoh, I guess, in one of those things. But anyway, we're saying it was no new thing in Rome. We're going to get to the worship of the emperors in Rome. It was something that, for Rome it was new. That was something they hadn't tried before. But it wasn't new as far as this was its invention or something. Many, if not most, of the Eastern monarchs, and I mean the monarchs, not some petty vassal king somewhere, but the monarchs, were often deified after death. Some of them were deified while they were alive. Of course, we have the notable example in our Bible of that, as a matter of fact, in Daniel. If you contrast chapters 3 and 6 of Daniel, we're going to read a little from chapter 6 here. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar is king. And do you remember what he requires of the people? He builds this image of gold many feet high. And the decree is passed that the sound of certain musical instruments, everyone is to fall before this golden image in Daniel 3 and worship it. That's just crass idolatry there, which we've talked about before, plain crass idolatry. But he wasn't worshipped, is the point. However, if you jump over into chapter 6, the first 9 verses, we have a new nation on the scene, the Medes and the Persians. We have, therefore, a new king on the scene, one Darius, and he is worshipped. Let's start with verse 1. So we have an example of this right in our Bible, and this was while this Eastern monarch was alive, not him dead before he goes through the process of deification. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Checks and balances in the government. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So they concoct this plan. The administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever." Now, when you see a phrase like that, don't think of deification there. That was just a common way to approach kings then as well as kings today. "O King Darius, live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. And then in the next few verses you find how Daniel chooses not to practice emperor worship and pray to this mere mortal. Even though he's king of the empire, Daniel's not far behind him as being king of the empire. So it would do no good. To pray to him would be the same as praying to oneself, in as high a position as is Daniel. But he prays to his God, as he is referred to in verse 10. He got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And these men go and question Darius, and of course we know the story. One thing that's interesting about this example of emperor worship, and I think we're going to see somewhat of some parallels whenever we get to Rome here in a moment, is number one, the fact that it's temporary. Notice this was just for 30 days. You're going to be a god for 30 days, in other words. I think we're to read some irony in this. Now, let me back up before I go any further, back up into that section of verses 6 through 9. That anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. It might be argued, well, that we're not told whether he, the king, would come under the classification of God or man here, since it said pray to any god or man. But that's just their terminology. If you're praying for help or for deliverance, or as probably what they intend here by prayer is supplication and worship and adoration, then if it is a man, you're attempting to deify him because no man is worthy of worship. So this bit of, as some people would try to find a loophole here, well, this is really not emperor worship. They're not really worshiping him as God. They're worshiping him as man. Well, that's the whole process. That's the whole problem there, emperor worship. Worshiping, giving worship and allegiance, glorification, deification to a mere mortal. We would expect that you would give that of a god. That's the whole problem here. They're giving it to and of a man. But it's only temporary. We're going to set this law in motion for the next month, for 30 days. Everyone who prays to whatever God they had been praying earlier, they must turn now from him and pray to you for 30 days. So it's mockery. How can he become a god all of a sudden, and then 30 days later, he's no longer worthy of worship or glorification or allegiance? So it's temporary. And secondly, it arose from motives other than those of a religious nature. And this will be one of the big things with the imperial cult of Rome. Although we are studying this under religious backgrounds, it could also properly fit somewhere else. But not really, not according to my thinking. It arose from motives other than religious. That is, jealousy and flattery. They were jealous of Daniel, so they tried to flatter the king, thereby entrapping Daniel and causing him to perish. And flattery sounds like a good motive for the imperial cult anyway. What man in his wrong mind wouldn't want to be worshipped by other men? So we don't have a lot of biblical examples of this. We have many examples of the Old Testament pantheons, the animism, the tribal form of worship, and all the idols, the idolatry in the Old Testament. Not very much of emperor worship, but it's there. And then secondly, still under historical background, if we go on to discuss Rome, which is our major point anyway. Now, I'm going to have to give you some of the history, and you have to follow this thought and this plan of development here, and I think you'll find it to be interesting, and it will tie in with what we want to begin discussing next week. I don't know how far we'll get then, but what we want to begin discussing next week anyway. And it ties in with what we've already studied before. We've kind of worked our way through the pagan forms of worship, the idolatry, the pantheons of these various nations, whether it was crass idolatry, where you'd actually bow before a carved pole, or whether it was, a more beautiful form of idolatry, to use beautiful in a corrupt manner, where you wouldn't actually look to any pole or something, but it would be a god behind something else, a god behind the sun, or a god behind the rain, or a god behind the moon or the stars, or something like that. Not as crass as just bowing before some stick or some, even if it's a beautiful one found in Rome or Greece in one of the temples, that's still a form of crass idolatry. Now, here's the problem then. Going back politically speaking, you know how Rome, by this time, has kind of taken over the Mediterranean world. Now, that means that she, with her military success, has just conquered and vanquished these territories all around the Mediterranean world. Well, what do you think Rome's military success would do to the faith of these conquered territories that they formerly had in their gods? Because certainly one of many of their gods would be gods of protection. There'd be gods of agriculture and all of that, but you've got all of these roving, barbarous bands traveling everywhere, and there's armies and warfare and fighting going on all the time. So one god you're going to have is a god of protection. Well, what will you think of your god of protection if Rome's military machine just rolls over you and mows you down? That kind of does your god of protection under. And if that does your god of protection under, well, maybe that's a strike at the root of your whole pantheon then. So in other words, by the time of the New Testament, you see, we're really having a religious change in the world at this time. We've seen a few examples of the idolatry and of the pantheons in the Old and the New Testament. Let's stay with the New, since we're talking about that, in the New Testament. But not that many, though. Paul's traveling all around in the Gentile world, in the Greek-speaking world, We might think that we should expect more references, and we find, as a matter of fact, very, very few. So why? Well, something's going on in the whole religious atmosphere of the Mediterranean world. And of course, it's a process that's taken a few hundred years, and it's going to take more years to complete the cycle and start over again, we might add. But with Rome conquering all these territories, it just destroys these people's good thoughts that they had at one time of their pantheon. So in other words, what I'm saying is they lost faith in the gods that they had. Now worship, according to the letter of their idolatrous liturgy, might have continued, but not as devotedly as formerly. I mean, think of Artemis in Acts 19. You might think that's devoted worship to Artemis, but what's the uproar really all about there in Acts 19? Isn't it a financial matter there? It's really not a religious matter, is it? It's a financial matter there. And we'll get to that here in a moment. The world is changing, and Rome's conquest of the world has caused the world, religiously speaking, to change in her attitudes to which she had had before. It's really not a question of religion over there. It's a question of financial gain. That craftsman's group of people there under Demetrius, they don't like the fact that if Paul preaches that religion and too many people believe it, well, there goes their lucrative business of selling these little miniature replicas, these little shrines of goddess Artemis or goddess Diana. So that's what's happening in all the surrounding territories around Rome. And secondly, what about Rome herself? Well, the pantheons are on the decline. People are tired of the greedy, rapacious, bloodthirsty, vindictive nature and ways of these gods. Plato ridiculed the religious views of Homer. Now, that was just part of Greek thought. I mean, those were the gods, but Plato was too smart for that. He ridiculed Homer's views of the gods. Socrates, remember, was put on trial. Do you remember the two accusations leveled against him? Corrupting the youth and despising the gods. Corrupting the youth and despising the gods. Now, if Socrates is impugning the gods, Plato is ridiculing earlier pantheistic views of the gods based on some of Homer's views, some of his writings. That carries right over into Roman thought sooner or later. Rome conquers Greece, and she picks that up. And so as a result of the decline of the pantheons in Rome, the decline of the pantheons in the conquered Mediterranean territories, a new religion is needed. You see, by the time we get to the New Testament, I think the golden days of the pantheons have passed for a number of reasons. Social reasons, economic reasons, all types that we don't need to get into tonight. But just suffice it to say that although we dealt quite a bit with idolatry in the pantheons thus far, they're not such a big issue after all. And our purpose, of course, in all of this is to get to one thing to which we're headed toward the end of this study. And you'll see how everything is going to culminate toward that. The religions of the world are passing off the scene as far as being a viable religion followed as devotedly by the people as they had in earlier days. The golden earlier days, both of Greece and of Rome, were something entirely different than what we see by the New Testament times. A new religion is needed. But here's what's interesting. Emperor worship was a political move and really not a religious experience at all. This then is going to have its ramifications, which will bring us chronologically into the next point on your outline, which will be, Lord willing, next week in our study. But we'll save that for then. Here's what's interesting. A new religion is needed. The pantheons aren't working anymore. The crass idolatry, I mean, it is there. We saw it in Acts 14. It has continued to some degree, to a greater or less degree, in different parts of the empire. But whenever your territory has been subdued by the military machine of Rome, you're going to think otherwise about your pantheon, especially whoever your God is that you term your God of protection. Whichever one you designate as the protective God of you and of your country and of your people, he or she will not look so well in your eyes after this. So we need a new religion, but the ironic thing is, with the introduction of emperor worship, we really don't have a new form of religion. It's solely based on political motives. It's nothing but a political move. And I think you can see why. It's the chief aim behind emperor worship is to politically and patriotically unite these far-flung, defeated provinces in the Roman Empire, part of the Mediterranean world. And emperor worship actually took root more strongly in these far-flung provinces of the empire than in Rome itself. Now, not a lot has been written on emperor worship. There's really not a lot of good resource material on it. And probably the reason why is, just as I'm describing now, it was not such a big thing after all. I don't even know if you've ever heard of emperor worship or the imperial cult. If you haven't, I wouldn't be surprised. And if you haven't, don't worry. It's not like not having heard of Judaism or not having, well, even of the pantheons. Oh, they stayed on top for years and years and years. But you see, if you've defeated all of these people, you don't really have a good, stable form of worship that is, what can we say, the state religion. The state religion was the Roman pantheon. The state religion was the Greek pantheon. These things are greatly declining now in attendance, and where attendance is not declining, the devotedness of the people is certainly on the decline. And so if this is happening, you've conquered the people, they have no gods, you've got to have something to unite yourself. Some common cause to rally around. And so we'll introduce a new religion, which really, remember, is not a religion. It's based primarily and solely, we could say, on political motives. It's a political move. We'll deify the emperor of Rome, since he obviously is the chief human figure, the chief political figure in that part of the world. We'll deify him, which will encourage patriotism, which will rally all of these provinces who are desperately in need of some new form of religion around their capital city, Rome, which will help secure them, guarantee them to remain part of the Roman Empire. Someone has said that the real religion, however, that is on the rise by the time of the first century, we're outside of Palestine for the moment, the real religion that was on the rise was monetary greed in Rome. I think that's true. What was the problem with Artemis in Acts 19? It was a monetary issue in question, not a religious one. Rome has incredible wealth pouring into the city from her practices of taxation as well as her conquering of other peoples in far-flung provinces of the empire. And people are getting their eyes on greed for money. Now, don't we almost see a parallel in the development of any nation from, let's say, a barbarous state up to a civilized or semi-civilized state? I mean, our country goes right along that same pattern. Earlier days, everyone just had all of their various gods. And as you become more civilized and the machinery of government flows more smoothly and things are more developed, all of a sudden you become self-sufficient. We're back to that theme again. And you don't need the gods. If you don't need the gods, you have to have something in their place. And the something that you put in their place is what's already there anyway, which is what has brought about their decline and their fall, that is, of the gods. And of course, that is monetary greed. That was probably the real religion. It was idolatry, but it was the idolatry that Paul speaks of in Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3, the idolatry of covetousness or monetary greed. So there's a historical background of how the religious situation has changed in the Mediterranean Roman world, why we see a decline in the pantheons, whether of the conquered territories or of Rome itself. Now, thirdly, let's start looking at the development. Emperor worship comes on the scene just prior to the time of Christ. That's how recent it is. We'll look at 5 different emperors here. We'll start with Augustus. Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar, descendant of Julius Caesar, a grandnephew of his, or adopted son, whichever you want to take. Now, Augustus pushed through the Senate a bill to attach a posthumous title of deity to Julius Caesar. Of course, it doesn't take place until after Caesar's death, Julius Caesar's death. He is successful in pushing this bill through the Senate, and so during the time of Augustus, I think you're probably rather familiar with these dates. Augustus starts, way back the 3rd decade BC and comes right up into the time of Christ. He, of course, according to Luke chapter 2, he is Roman Emperor Caesar whenever Christ is born. Augustus Caesar. Came to pass in the days of Augustus Caesar that a decree went out of taxation or of enrollment. So he's successful in doing this. So Julius Caesar becomes the first deified emperor, but of course it does him no good because he's dead now. What did Augustus do for himself? Well, he adamantly refused any titles of deity for fear of alienation. And here's what I mean by alienation. Yes, eventually the far-flung provinces and their peoples are going to need some rallying point, but with Rome having just come on the scene here in the last 100 years now, and having overthrown these tyrannical Eastern monarchs, Augustus does not want to have himself be seen by all of these people in these far-flung provinces as some big somebody. So he simply refers to himself as the princeps, which meant the first citizen. He was nothing more than everyone else. We have done away with the ancient glory of Rome. Now we're starting the real new glory of Rome, which is the Republic of Rome. And in a republic, all men are created equal. We are all citizens. And I, as your king, as emperor, Augustus Caesar, I am simply princeps, your first citizen, the first citizen of the empire. But I'm no more, really, than anyone else. I'm a king, but I'm certainly not a god. So he declined any title of deity. Then the next emperor, Tiberius. Tiberius, who would have been emperor during the life of Christ, his life and ministry and death. Tiberius Caesar also, like Augustus Caesar, declined all titles of deity. However, there was a coin minted during his time. We've mentioned this earlier in the intertestamental period study, which had on the obverse side Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. Well, we're back to the same principle practiced by Augustus. Whenever the Caesar before him died, he pushed a bill through the Senate to have him deified. Well, whenever then that Caesar Augustus dies, Tiberius does essentially the same thing. Therefore, he's referred to on the obverse side of this coin as Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. And on the reverse side, we simply have his title Pontifex Maximus, which I'm sure Jesus would have understood there in Matthew 22 with that question as high priest or chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. Not really a claim to deity, though. In other words, he is Pontifex Maximus. Augustus Caesar was divine. But of course, he's dead now, so that does no good for him. Then thirdly, we come to Caligula, the madman. Well, he wasn't the only one. They had a few of them. Caligula. Now, Caligula in AD 40 wanted to have a statue of Zeus in his likeness erected in the temple at Jerusalem. Now, that would be coming very, very close to living deification then. to have a statue of the chief god, Zeus, in your likeness, in other words, carved after the representation of Caligula, erected in the Jerusalem temple. Well, of course, the Jews would not put up with anything like this at all. So they sent off a dispatch, a delegation, and that thankfully was stopped. We know enough earlier from some of our earlier studies here in the intertestamental period class in the political realm, how the Romans, they knew that the Jewish people and the Jewish territory, that was a sensitive area. And they only overstepped their bounds occasionally. Most of the time they realized it didn't pay to overstep your bounds here, because the Jewish people were just fanatical monotheists. And to have some representation of a living man after a statue of Zeus set up in the holy temple of God at Jerusalem before its fall here, well, that would have probably meant civil war before the Civil War, which came 30 years later. Then the fourth man I mentioned, Nero. In other words, if you can see thus far from what I'm saying, we're not saying much. There's not much for emperor worship thus far. I come across it many times in some of my readings, but there's really not much to it. Not yet, at least. Nero. Nero is the first emperor to wear the corona radiata, this crown on his head, the corona radiata.
For the continuation